Today I'm releasing the first video in my pink inspired skein challenge. I am working with the Lion brand yarns Re-Up recycled cotton and polyester blend yarn, and these are both size 4 medium weight yarn. And for this you're going to want to grab a size G or 4 1/4 millimeter crochet hook. And we're going to begin by attaching the yarn to our crochet hook using a magic circle. Then we're going to chain 1 and place 8 single crochets inside of our magic circle. And once you have your 8 single crochets in place, then you're going to pull on your tail to tighten the gap in your magic circle. And for this next part, you're going to need a stitch marker or safety pin or scrap piece of yarn. And for our next row, we're going to skip our little tiny chain 1, and we're going to dive right into our first single crochet, and we're going to place 2 single crochets right in that stitch. And we're going to grab our stitch marker and mark the first of those 2 stitches. And from here, you're going to place 2 single crochets in each stitch in your row, going all the way around, and you should have a total of 16 single crochets. And your row ends when you make it back to your stitch marker, so you can go ahead and remove it. And the pattern for our next row is to place 1 single crochet in our first stitch and then 2 single crochets in our second stitch. And we're going to want to mark the first stitch again. And we're going to repeat that alternating pattern going all the way around our row for a total of 24 single crochets. And again, you can remove your stitch marker at the end of your row. And the pattern for our next row is to place 1 single crochet in our first 2 stitches and then 2 single crochets in our third. And we're going to repeat this pattern going all the way around our row for a total of 32 single crochets. And the pattern for our next row is to place 1 single crochet in our first 3 stitches. And again, we want to mark the first stitch. And then we want to place 2 single crochets in our 4th stitch. And we're going to repeat this pattern going all the way around our row for a total of 40 single crochets. And at the end of your row, you can remove your stitch marker and set it to the side. That was our last row of increasing, so the pattern from here is just going to be to place 1 slip stitch in the front loop only of each stitch in our row, going all the way around. And we're going to continue working this in a spiral, and we are going to follow this pattern for a total of 38 rows. One thing to note, you want to keep your slip stitches really loose, otherwise they will become impossible to work in. And as you're working these rows, I recommend inserting your wine bottle a few times just to make sure that you aren't tightening up too much in this project. And once you have your 38 rows of slip stitches in the front loop only, then your wine tote should look something like this. And you will need your safety pin or stitch marker for the next part. We're going to switch colors, but we want to hold on to our loop here. So what we're going to do is place a slip stitch up underneath our next full stitch. And then we want to place a slip stitch in the back loop only of our following stitch. Next, we're going to slide our safety pin in the loop that is on our crochet hook. And what this allows us to do is pull this loop out and start crocheting with it again, which is exactly what we want to do. And go ahead and grab that next color, and we're going to attach our yarn to our crochet hook using a slip knot. From here, we're going to dive into the front loop only of that last stitch where we worked in the back loop only. So again, we're just going to insert our crochet hook in that front loop only. And we're going to place one single crochet in that stitch. Then we're going to chain one, and we're going to skip our next stitch and then place a single crochet in the following stitch. And again, we're going to chain one and skip a stitch and place a single crochet in our next stitch. So that's going to be our pattern going all the way around our row. We're going to chain one and skip a stitch and then place a single crochet in that next stitch. So go ahead and repeat that, and I will meet back up with you at the end of the row. And when you get to the end of your row, you should have one stitch right here remaining before you have your last slip stitch with your previous color. And so go ahead and make sure you've placed your chain one after your single crochet. And then what we're going to do is we're going to place a single crochet right here in this gap where we have our chain one. But we want to work in the gap between our single crochet stitches. So from here, we're just going to chain one and then place a single crochet in our next gap. And we are going to repeat this pattern for 3 rows. So I will meet back up with you at the end of those 3 rows. And you know you're at the end of your 3 rows when you may get back to your stitch marker from your other color. From here, what I want you to do is make sure you've placed a chain one after your last single crochet. And we're just going to place a slip stitch in our next gap right here. And from here, we're going to cut and tie off our blue colored yarn. From here, you're going to want to pull out your loop from your pink colored yarn. You can remove your stitch marker. Go ahead and insert your crochet hook in that loop. And we're going to chain 3. And then working back up in your top row, we want to work in the second stitch back from where we cut and tied off our yarn. So right here, and we're just going to place one loose slip stitch in that stitch. Now skipping past where we tied off our yarn, we're going to place another slip stitch in our following stitch. And then we're going to place one slip stitch in each stitch going all the way around our row. And make sure you keep these slip stitches nice and loose. And when you get to the end of your row, you're just going to dive right into your first front loop only of that first slip stitch. And we're going to place a slip stitch there. Then we're going to place one slip stitch in the front loop only of each stitch in our row, and we want to repeat this for the next 4 rows. And after working your 4 rows, then your pattern should look something like this. From here, we're going to create the handles by chaining 10. And once you have your 10 chains in place, then we're going to skip 10 stitches. And we're going to place a slip stitch in the front loop only of that 11th stitch. And we're going to place one slip stitch in the front loop only of our next 9 stitches, for a total of 10 slip stitches in the front loop only. And once you have your 10 slip stitches in place, then we're going to chain 10 again. And again, we're going to skip 10 stitches. And we're going to place a slip stitch in the front loop only of that 11th stitch. And we're going to place one slip stitch in the front loop only of our next 9 stitches for a total of 10 slip stitches in the front loop only. And this should get you back to your first handle. And when you make it back to your first handle, you're just going to continue placing one slip stitch in the front loop only of each stitch in your handle. And when you get to the end of your handle, you're just going to continue to place one slip stitch in the front loop only, going all the way around your row and over that second handle. And you're just going to follow that pattern until you get back to your first handle. And when you make it back around to your first handle, you're just going to continue that pattern for the following 6 rows. And so now your wine tote should look something like this. And make sure you've ended your last row somewhere between your second and your first handle. What we're going to do from here is just place one slip stitch in our following 2 stitches, and then we're going to cut and tie off our yarn. So these are slip stitches under the full stitch. And I'm going to hide this tail up the inside of my wine tote. And you do have the option to just roll down the top edge a little bit. It will stay here because of the nature of this stitch. Thank you so much for working this pattern with me. And if you're interested in following along with my skein challenge for these 2 colors, then check the links in the description. And if you follow along with the skein challenge video, you should use up both skeins entirely without any yarn left over.